Today, I want to talk about spirituality, religion, a little bit of culture, and so on, the environment we live in. So, I think religion is very important. And by religion, I want to be very specific, or maybe it's very general. A religion is a practice. So, it is something I bind myself towards. For example, one of the things I advise people who want to grow spiritually is to make a resolution, have some sense of, I am tying myself to this practice. I am now going to meditate every day or whenever you've decided that this is important. I think I'm going to do mantra, or I think I'm going to do prayer, or I'm going to go to a workshop, try to understand myself, or just even dream work, writing my dreams down, talking to more spiritual people or a spiritual teacher. These are all things you're going to bind yourself to this process. That's religion. So I don't think it's very healthy to have spirituality just without religion. It's not impossible, certainly. In fact, for me, it's helped me not to have a specific religion, but to discover one or discover the elements within various traditions that I can follow and I can make sense out of. It took me a long time to understand that. But I also know that it's so easy to go astray. I've been around the spiritual communities basically since the 60s and uh, been involved in this or that practice. And I realized that I couldn't tie myself to any of it because it was out, to be blunt, it was outdated. It didn't, my Catholicism, I went through a religious crisis in my early teens, and I just couldn't tolerate it. I just could not stand Catholicism. It's just too negative. And of course, I was kicked out of Catholic school. That didn't help, but they were, it's just a negative, ultimately a negative religion. There's good stuff about it. I've met priests that were very helpful. I've met religious people, chaplains, nuns that were very spiritual and very good. It's not that you cannot be spiritual, you cannot grow spiritually within a formal Christian religion. I think it is possible, but I think it is very difficult. It's hard to work that because so much is involved with judgments and dogma and all the rest of it. And it's difficult for us who live in a society that is now filled with information. There are all kinds of religions. You can study, which I did. I studied Buddhism and yoga, the yogic philosophy, not just hatha yoga, but all the yogas. I've studied every one of them and worked with them to some extent. I'm not an expert. I'm not a swami or anything like that. I just studied them to the best of my ability to pick up what was essential in those religions and in those spiritual traditions, such as they were. In each of those places, I've met people who were very solid in their spiritual practice, as far as I could see. On the other hand, there are also many people in this religion that are deeply fearful. For example, evangelical religion that is very evangelical, we'll call it evangelical Christianity, even though it's really not. I live in the South, and so it's traditional people around here are all, you know, believers or part of that community that automatically believes that the Bible is inerrant, meaning it cannot make any mistakes on a theological or moral level, or exactly true. So everything in that book is exactly what happened whenever they said that, and every practice that is suggested is absolutely sure to be completely true. Well, if you could possibly say that about the New Testament, or at least the four essential gospels that's been handed to us, but you cannot make an argument that if you consider the Old Testament's all over the place. I mean, it justifies killing and torturing people. It dignifies rape and theft and looting and everything. It's just awful. If you read that, and just the most negative kind of thoughts emerge out of, and selfish thoughts that have nothing to do with what most of us who attempt to do spiritual practice assert. Um, just mindlessly worshiping a God that is channeled through prophets. And it's the prophets in ancient Israel were people who channeled God. God talked to the Israeli people, the Judean religion. They would, like every other religion, had the same thing. Whether it's shamanism, whether it was the Greeks and the Romans, God or a God spoke to them through a prophet or through a channeler. Now we recognize that channeling is very real and channels all over the place. They ask spirit to come to them. They have a spirit guide friend who helps them sort through this and that, and then calls in dead relatives to people who search out for those and so on. I don't think that's wrong. I'm just highly skeptical of it. I think it depends on the individual. Some of the channels are very good and really dovetail precisely with what we need. And I'm not saying that channeling, that you can't trust it because I know for a fact that the spiritual world is filled with spirits who lie. They know everything because they have a connection with that extra dimension. In that extra dimension that we don't see and we don't connect with necessarily, everything is known. So someone could claim, I go to a channeler and they could claim to be my grandmother, and they would know all about her. They would know all the things she liked. They would be able to remember parts of our lives together that only I would know, only me and the grandma would know really happened. And I would say, oh, that's definitely Granny. Okay, no, that may or may not be the case because any discarnate spirit, almost that it's worth its salt, can do that, can fake you out and can fake the channeler out. That's why channelers have a very hard time, and the best of them are enmeshed in spiritual process and spiritual practices that keep their energy more pure, so they don't attract these lying negative entities. So I don't want to badmouth channelers. I just want you to be very careful and make sure you know the person pretty well and you size them up and see what their vibe is for you. Some channelers definitely have this distorted vibe, um, and some don't. Some are like more into the ego thing, and it takes time to an observation to observe that. And because I've been around this stuff like I said, in one way or another since the 60s. Um, I have a sensitivity to it and a nose for it, so I can kind of tell who's to what. Every one of them is authentic to some degree, but some of them are a little bit twisted this way and or twisted that way. And for me, I'm careful with trying to understand where those people are coming from. And that's where religion comes in handy. And religion is very, very negative. I don't know why, but they're very negative towards channeling, except when people speak. In some churches, people will speak in gibberish or different languages that may or may not be real. Light language is what it's called in the New Age movement, and it's channeling something, but I'm not sure what. Many religions, unfortunately, particularly Christian religions and churches, they make an attempt to be positive, but in the end, they twist around and they're always into power and often money and show business. So my encounter is that there are a certain number of churches, particularly mega churches, that are into show business. So a lot of that is very dramatic, like the Catholic Church, but also evangelical churches. Some of them are good, they're not, there's some of them that do really great things and try to develop people's spirituality and their soul, particularly those that encourage service to others. Service to others is always a very positive sign that a church is at least more positive than negative. And so churches that try to do that are, are to some extent, are positive, and you can align yourself with them. But for the most part, they're depending on an ideology, conceptual framework, or mythical framework that is just doesn't make any sense today. We are not the same kind of people that lived 5,000 years ago, or whenever it was, 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. We're very different. Not that our biology is very different necessarily, but our culture is very, very different. It's developed along totally different lines from religion. Since about I I connect I believe the modernist movement, or modern times, if you want to call it that, started. I give a date, basically 1650. Okay, that the period, maybe the century before, if you recall, the printing press changed a lot and began to bring printed materials of these books that were only studied by mainly clergy people into the general public, generally middle class, educate and upper class educated people. They were able to read these books in manuscript, which was written by hand. But when the printing and that was rare. You had to really work to find these books. With the printing press, these books were much more available, where maybe five books were available, and you'd have to travel to Rome or to Paris to study them. Now, there would be like hundreds of the same book available, particularly the Bible, thousands of these books all over the Western European, Western, specifically, mainly Western Europe, because by the 17th century, people had begun to be there were more literate people, partly because of the printing press. So whatever it is, the printing press brought this information. And since the printing press, and the unpopularity of religious war, which happened after the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was resolved in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, just a very significant date. That's why I place the modern period to be 1650 onwards. So these ideas that, oh, my religion is right, no, my religion is right, oh no, I'll kill you if you don't believe the way I do, that period began to wane, and people said, well, how can we determine what's true and what's not true? And what had been emerging for even 100 years before then was science, was the idea of science. So science is, you test reality, you find a way to find out what this really is, what is actually happening when a fire burns, what is actually happening with the planets. Are they circling the Earth as was thought before Copernicus, or is the sun the center of the universe? Well, we found through careful observation, through telescopes, through careful note taking about where the planets were and when. And so you got an idea that there were these orbits around the sun, not around the Earth. And the whole technique of finding out where the planets were before this idea was very cumbersome. Uh, and you can look that up. It was just very different. And it was extremely hard to really have accurate um, data on where the planets were, which were very important because astrology was still important as a what they considered a science. So we had to know where the planets were when they went here, when they went there. Most courts, dukes and kings, and would have astrologers around to gauge when they should go to war, when they shouldn't, et cetera, et cetera. This was quite common. After 1650, that pretty much, except for a few, disappeared. And people began to think more in terms of science. How can we test this? What happens when uh, something burns? Let's observe this. What's a vacuum? And so they were just, how are chemicals put together? How can we classify animals and plants so that it makes sense and so we can find some logical structure within all this that we can easily connect some dots. So the modern period was a time of science, a time of inquiry into things, not by looking at religion and what do the priests say, how did the world start, when was what date creation was, and this and that. Well, eventually, all the sort of the ideas that were current in Christianity, mainly Catholicism and later even Protestantism, which wasn't really that different, many of the ideas at that time were debunked. I mean, you couldn't go back through the Bible and say that the Earth was birthed in 4004 BC because uh, that's nowhere near the age of the Earth. Okay, and eventually people found that through dealing with fossils, and eventually carbon dating came about, and all these scientific ideas that totally demolished the old-fashioned ideas of how nature works, how it was developed, and so on. And I don't want to make religion entirely wrong. I think symbolically, some of the ideas from Christianity, you could like work with them in symbolic ways, and I will talk about that in a moment here. So by by the time the United States was born in 1776 to 1789, that was the basic birthplace of the United States. Declaration of Independence in 1789 or whenever it was, around there when we adopted the Constitution of the United States. We were trying to find not something that was brought to us by revelation, but we were trying to create a rational republic. If anything you can say about the founders, and they weren't always right or perfect, but they had a rational view, by the very carefully thought out rational view of how people interact, what kind of institutions might be very helpful to help society develop and grow. These guys really, really thought about it. And if you read any of the Federalist Papers, you'll see this really very carefully thought out set of ideas that had their origin in philosophers of perhaps a century before. But throughout that century, the 18th century, that is the 1700s, was a great growth in philosophy, a great growth in thinking about stuff, because you were no longer trapped in the religious, place. Even Descartes, who was the pioneer of rational thought in the previous century, had to be very careful um, in his philosophy, saying he based his philosophy on a foundation, not a religious foundation, but an experiential foundation. He said, I think, therefore I am. Because I have a thought, I exist. Of course, I've talked about this a lot of times. I don't know if I've done a video on it, but that's that's doesn't work. But whatever it was, he built his philosophy up, and in the end came up with the Catholic doctrine. Because if he hadn't, I don't know what would have happened to him. I think he would have been hurt. His hand would have been slapped rather severely, because that was still a time when religion was willing to put you on the rack. Although that faded very quickly. By the 18th century, that Inquisition mentality had faded, and we started talking rationally about things. And this was great because now we could discover nature without being stuck in these conceptual frameworks that kept us bound to a very narrow biblical viewpoint, or at best, a biblical viewpoint that was augmented by Greek, mainly Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle more than any of them, because he was very structured. And the Catholic Church with Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century tried to uh, tried to marry the biblical Christian account to Aristotle. And it's a beautiful attempt. I'm not going to criticize Aquinas at all. I think he had his mind. He was really honestly trying to marry faith with intellect. And, if you want to go into that, check it out. So, my point here is that the old religions that were begin to be banished from Western society in the 18th century, and then it came back up in a different form in the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, where you would get these religious revivals. So this very carefully thought out stuff from people like Thomas Jefferson, uh, where emerging not as thoughts anymore, but as emotions. So the 18th century philosophers tended to kind of strangle emotions. It was just being reasonable. Well, people aren't really reasonable. I mean, they have aspects of reason, but in fact, we're a lot of things, and we have emotions, and we have love, and we have our hearts full sometimes. And so the poets of the late 18th century, early 19th century, like William Wordsworth, William Blake, and others, were recapturing the sort of religious feeling and the sort of bohemian explosion of the 19th century was really cool because you one of the people like Walt Whitman couldn't have lived 100 years previously. He was both he was mainly he was kind of a mystical poet, and he had very deep emotions and made connections, and so he that tradition continued with artists who did weird things and abstract art and novels and writers they replaced religion because they would delve deeply into human emotion and human structure. People like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, Dickens and Chekhov and all these people, the novelists of the 19th century, particularly early 20th century, they really replaced in many ways the religion for the more intelligent people of the middle and upper middle classes and upper classes too, as well. So there was a lot of intellectual activity, not only in science, as obviously with the growth of technology and the discovery of all kinds of things in the 19th century and then in the 20th century. It continued. We continued this civilization of reason, and we throw in our emotions and our spiritual values, not in religion, but in art, in music, in yeah, art, music, uh, literature. Sorry, I missed that. So that became the replacement for religion for us because the old religion increasingly could not connect with the modern times. Now, one of the things that happened in America was the theologians began teaching a critical biblical, looking at the Bible critically. And so you use philology and different techniques in order to analyze the language and the language usage and where the voice, for example, Genesis was broken down to two or three different stories. You could separate all those stories, and it looks like, and this is the theory, that Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, I think several versions of this, were several books kind of put together at some point, probably um, when they were putting together the Greek Bible a couple of hundred years before Christ. They melded these stories that were around the Jewish community into single voices, at least in Genesis. And then the other books, I'm not going to talk about. It's too complicated. Each of them has a problem. Uh, with authenticity, what tradition is it? And so they broke that down. So it was called biblical criticism. So after that period, there grew up the in the United States evangelical movement, and one of the excellent pieces of art that grew out of that was the play about the trial, the Scopes trial in I think the 20s or somewhere like that, where Clarence Darrow represented the teacher who was teaching evolution, and William Jennings Bryan was representing the local community that wanted to repress the teaching of evolution. Um, can't remember the name of the play now, but anyway, this was a play on science versus revealed religion, and in the play, science trounced religion, and the guy Scopes, came off looking good, even though I think Darrow lost the actual trial. It was so popular and so much filled the media landscape at that time that it was the traditions of evangelical Christianity were kind of looked down upon by intelligent people. It was something that sort of stayed in the South and parts of the Midwest with relatively uneducated people. That was the story of it. And so we tended to look down on that, except in the South where I live. So they just continued the tradition of just believing everything in the Bible is true, and there's nothing, there can't be any deviation from the teachings. Well, that kind of puts religion in a ghetto. Some religions have tried to be, quote, liberal, which is to say, okay, you know, we think that this is true, but it might not be. And, they were just general and kind of, bringing vague ideas into religious practice. Now, these vague ideas weren't bad. It just did not have the appeal. Because if I'm going through shit in my life, I don't want to have a bunch of vague platitudes. I want to have like something more solid, something I can definitely follow, some principles I can definitely live by. Believe in Jesus. Well, what is Jesus? And so you have to understand, how does that work? What is the Jesus energy? What is the Christ consciousness that people talk about? And that's what we need religion for. We need to understand what these feelings or these inspirations, how do we structure that in a way that makes sense and we won't just be fighting each other? So my view is that we start, as I've said in these videos, we start with realizing that our true self, there is a true self. And this I get from the yogic philosophy. I think we can marry these different traditions. I didn't really understand Christianity, for example, till particularly when I studied more deeply Buddhism. So the Buddhist tradition kind of helped me. Not that I'm a Buddhist, I'm not. But I work with that kind of consciousness that has really illumined my life, along with the yogic philosophy, which I've spent more time with. But I still didn't. But the Buddhism, for some reason, was the link between this sort of yogic thing. I practiced a lot of yoga, both spiritually and physically. It didn't quite link up with Christianity for me. And the Buddhism really helped because it concentrates on consciousness. Not that yogic philosophy doesn't. It's just there's a lot more sort of curlicues around that. Where in Buddhism, it's real simple, really simple. You're in the moment. This is who you are. You're suffering because you're ignorant of your true nature. Very, very simple. Now, that can be applied once I to Christianity. Once I understood that, and then I understood what Jesus was talking about in the Gospels, particularly his stories and his parables. For me, the prodigal son is maybe the two great what do you call parables. The prodigal son is the first that I consider important because it was really clear that practicing a religion or being in this careful structure and not straying from it is not considered to be a high spiritual principle by Jesus. He saw the prodigal son indulge in the most awful from Christian, usual church viewpoints as being complete sin. He was fucking around and he was wasting his money. He was doing everything bad a person can do according to, the usual traditional way of doing things. Not only that, but he was living in a pigsty, which was the bottom of the barrel in life because the Jews considered pigs to be the most unclean animals, and that was the lowest level you could go to because he was basically laying around in pig shit. So after that, he decided to go back to his father and see if he could take him back somehow. Well, what did his father do? He honored him as his special guest and put him above the son that stayed with him that had been doing everything right. He'd been doing as he's told, he was responsible. So, the prodigal son story is perfect for a person like me, the artist type, who's made many mistakes, blew a lot of money, all the things that the prodigal son did, one way or another, were kind of, a little bit like me, not fortunately, not completely. But there's an element of that, particularly in all artists, I think. They tend to go in the opposite direction that society wants them to go. And that exploration enables them to bring back a deeper wisdom for the community. And that's why the father in the story honored that prodigal son above all others, because he had experience. And that experience of degradation or negativity, as we would call it, is a very important principle and one that I want to emphasize as much as possible here. I think I've talked about negativity already and how that debilitates us, but we have to look at it. We have to, and we may have to live it. We may have to indulge in, quote, sin in order to understand it better. I don't know. I can't judge that. It helps, for example, a person I was just I'd seen some YouTube videos, and you see this of addicts who've reformed. Well, they become very powerful spiritually because they've been to the bottom. When you've been to the bottom, you've been, in a sense, crucified. And the story of Jesus, which is beautiful also, that no other religion has this structure. Jesus died on the cross, suffering terribly. He was buried, and then he rose from the dead. This is very important symbolically. And the critical thing about religion and practicing religion is to understand how powerful symbols are. Symbols symbols aren't just these sort of cute things these are they're themes to life. We are each in some way crucified in life. And by confronting that crucifixion, by accepting that, we are able to resurrect ourselves. We die, in a certain sense, only to be reborn. And that is the essential Christian story. And that's why I consider myself a Christian, if you want to call me that, because I see that the basic teachings of Jesus as reflected in the Gospels, most of his stories, not all the stuff that may or may not have been true, the accounts of his life, but I think the parables and his teachings are all probably pretty authentic. And it also is registered on outside what are called the Gnostic Gospels and the New Ethiopian Gospels that are now being talked about a lot. They show a different angle to Jesus and his teachings. Anyway, we have all the information we need, even without all that, by just following his parables. The other parable that I like or that I feel is very important for us, is the parable of the vineyard, where the owner of the vineyard hires somebody to help him pick the grapes. And then he realizes after a few hours that that's not going to be enough. He needs to hire a couple, some more people. So he hires some more, and then he does this several times. So then he hires them again at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and then in the last hour before sunset, which is when people stop working in those days, he had to hire a few more to help to make sure that it's all done, all wrapped up, and all ready to go. All these grapes, whatever they do with them. The important thing is to understand he pays each of those workers the same. So whether you're working 12 hours or 1 hour, you got the same amount of money. Very, very important because this is a very clear teaching on materialism and what's called keeping accounts. So even and also the thief on the story of the thief on the cross who was instantly saved or achieved enlightenment or whatever you want to call it. The point is, it doesn't matter when you do your spiritual practice, whether you're 20 or you're 60 or you're 70 or you're 80. You're always going to get there. You're always going to get the same thing, which is the expansion of the heart. That's what Christianity is. Christianity, in its essence, is expansion of the heart area in what's called the heart chakra. It is very uh, it's very heart centered at best. When they enter into the fear stuff, like I had my little friend when I was a teen, her name was Cindy, and she would talk about how I needed to be saved because otherwise I would spend everlasting time everlasting in hell and suffer horribly. And she was really, she liked me a lot. And so she was really sad. She didn't want me to die and then go to hell. Well, that kind of religion is that? I'm going to be saved by just Jesus. I don't understand what Jesus is just a dude on a cross or whatever he is. And then I'm supposed to just say, okay, I do whatever you say. Well, what does that mean? Now, it could be worse. I mean, it's not a terrible thing to be saved, but to be saved because you're afraid of eternal suffering, that's not any kind of religion I want to have anything to do with. It's just ridiculous. It's do this or I'll kill you. Well, okay, worse than kill you, I'll torture you for eternity. The idea that God would torture people for eternity as a time span is just so obviously horrible. I can't see anybody, any person who's heart centered, any person who has a modicum of intelligence could accept. And I've seen people struggle with this. I struggled with it as a teen. Oh, I'm going to hell because no, that's ridiculous. Now, the only thing I can say about hell and eternity is that, yes, in a sense, when you're suffering horribly because you're so caught up in your ego principles and life doesn't work for you and you get slammed in the face with whatever's going on with you because of that ego, because you're selfish or just doing messed up things or hurting other people because you enjoy it or whatever. That is a kind of hell. And in the moment, I consider the moment sort of a vague term. That's where eternity can exist. So, in that sense, hell has a certain reality. Heaven and hell have a reality. Particularly if we keep on suffering in the way that from ego, I'm better than others. That's suffering actually, because you know what? You're going to get shown up one of these days, and then what? So um, we need to bring religion down to practical things like, okay, you follow your ego, you're going to suffer, you're going to go to hell. briefly. I mean, you can then be saved. You can be saved by saying, I am not going in that direction of this ego self. I'm going to go into my authentic self, that part of me that is connected to everything else. It's that essential self, what in yogic philosophy is called the Atman. In that philosophy, the Atman and Brahman are the same. And I've said this before in one or two other videos, but this is where this is our true self. This is what we're trying to emerge from the garbage of our egotistical life. And all of us have it, myself included. I mean, I struggle with ego all the time. But because I'm familiar with these techniques that I've developed from yogic teachings, Buddhist teachings, Christian teachings, and so on, I kind of have can put them in perspective and handle it much easier than most people. So I don't suffer as much, nothing else, right? I mean, that's cool. So um, let's be open to religion, but we need to find a new kind of religion. I'm suggesting that we can start connecting together, all of us, or not. I can be there, or other people can create something of a new kind of Christianity that gets rid of the fear energy. And like I said, the fear energy attracts what the Christian would call demonic spirits. They exist. You can be, all these things that Christianity, oh, if you do psychic work, you're going to be possessed. Da, da, da. To some extent, that's true. If you go off in directions that are messed up, very spiritual, but you do it for a selfish purpose, it's it's possible that you can be uh, have spirits attached to you, or if you're around that, or whatever. It's mysterious why spirits possess people. I don't quite understand that, but I've seen it, and it's always unique. But all I can say is if you write your path and you move in the direction of your own authenticity, the negative spirits they can't feed on you. So if they can't feed on you, they don't get any food. If you have negative feelings, ego feelings, if you have fear, if you have anger, if you have greed, if you have judgment of other people, oh, look at that junkie over there, they're just shit. We should just throw them in the trash. Those kinds of things, those are all things we need to work on. You can't live that way because you're going to be destroyed by these spiritual forces. They'll keep eating and eating at you. They may not actually possess you, but they're going to dominate your life. And every time you do a bad thing to someone else, they give you a little rush, right? A little chemical boost. And sometimes, and some people can actually do these kinds of what are called satanic rituals. They're very real and they do work. You can make a deal with the devil, so to speak, and get extra power. That's possible. I'm not discounting that. So we're dealing here with a dangerous situation. And I want to close with one thing. Christianity really became popular in the Roman world because it was a way, a path, and it had a symbol in the symbol of Jesus, both the resurrected and the crucified Jesus, who how do I say it? Become healed from the negative spirits. And because it had a successful run of helping people get rid of these negative spirits by having them adhere to Christian principles at the time, which were quite different early in the church, by the way. Don't think that Christianity of the first and second century AD was like the one we have, like the religion that we have today. Totally different. This was before it became this official state religion of Rome, which completely destroyed a lot of fundamental things in Christianity. The Roman Church really was a continuation of the Roman Empire. It was about power. And just so you know, I am descendant of several popes. My great grandmother was in papal nobility, so I bear some of the blame here, or my bloodline does. So let's get back to something more real, something more useful, something more 21st century. You cannot go back. I know a lot of people do. A lot of people give their lives to Jesus and then they go to these churches where they talk about going to hell and all the rest of it. Somebody starts talking about hell, I'm gone. I'm gone. And they usually don't know what they're talking about. It's some imaginary place. They're talking to an imaginary God they have no experience of. They haven't gone through the spiritual process of understanding what authenticity is, of connecting with Jesus energy. For whatever reasons in life, I was given that grace. Um, in several times in my life when I was saved by Jesus. The energy of Jesus came into my heart, like in the picture, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I experienced that directly, unambiguously. It saved me from suicide. So as soon as I decided, I lit right up with Jesus energy. But it's energy that I have. I've not lost it, it's still there. I've sometimes obscured it through my own BS. And remember, we each process all the bullshit from our parents, our grandparents, our society, the values that we subtly accept, the stances we take on things, the asshole attitudes I had in the past. Um, I had to deal with all of them because they kept me away from my authentic self. And so this practice was something that emerged in my life that works for me, at least so far, right? So take this into account. Try to think about being religious by attaching yourself to a mode of seeing that starts with your authentic self. All the societal attitudes, all the religious nonsense, put that aside. Start with the heart of who you are. Till next time. Bye.